then that will finish my kind of teaching on virtue ethics. So we've covered in this little ethics series, we've covered Aristotle and an introduction to eudaimonia, Aristotle and an introduction to the golden mean, and then this lesson, and we've looked at the strengths and weaknesses, and those lesson videos are on the website and Google Class and so on. And this is lesson 4 of 5 lessons, I think. And there'll be one more lesson. So we're looking at Aquinas and virtue ethics, and one more lesson, which will be on modern virtue ethicists. You'll notice Alistair McIntyre and Philippa Foot are the 2 chosen modern virtue ethicists. So I'm also working very hard to roll out some videos on the anthology work. So you should be chugging along with that. If you've done your mock exam and submitted that, certainly that needs to be in by the end of the term. And that will ensure that you're in a good place for next year. We've done 2 anthology pieces across philosophy, Buddhism, and ethics. And so I should have the videos to go with those on YouTube, and I'll announce those. But watch out, I'm going to do some tonight and post them. Just trying to get it really nice and so it communicates well, and you can make good notes and you learn the stuff. So let's get going. Anybody, just to start off, anybody got any big overriding questions you want to ask before we get going with today's lesson?
Yes, sir. This is a question you asked me to remind about.
Oh, Izzy, could you say that again? You broke up there.
You asked me to remind you about work for me for next year.
Ah, yes. Can you keep harassing me about that, Isabel? I'm the kind of person, I'm doing so many things. That's absolutely a fantastic idea. Some of the work I'm doing anyway will help. But absolutely, Izzy, I will support you in that. Okay, let's have a go at today's lesson then. So if you can find the lesson start task in the Google Classroom, so the ethics lesson, that is, what is it? Ethics. I forget. It's ethics, whatever it is. And then you find the lesson start task. So here are some virtues at the top of the page. You'll find it looks like this. So we start with fortitude, and gratitude. What famous Christian saint might be a saint of fortitude and gratitude? What about strength, stamina, perseverance, and justice? That's a pretty, this is almost like superhuman. This is like hero stuff. Humility. What saint would we put with humility and love? And here are 4 saints. I'll give you some clues. Francis of Assisi, well, he talked with the birds, but there is a very interesting story about what he did in terms of some work he did. Saint Sebastian was one of the martyrs. He's remembered for dying more than anything. Mother Teresa, I'm sure you've heard of her. I'm not going to give anything away. And Mary. So put your name in, and then next to them, which you could copy and paste, what virtues would you put next to them? What would you think? Which virtues? You can copy and paste if you can. What from the top? I was thinking it would. I'm always trying to figure out new ways of doing stuff. This may or may not work, but I thought it'd be a nice way. You just copy and paste the next to them. We'll see who thinks which one is which. So Ollie's gone for stamina and justice with Mary. Interesting. Not saying it's right or wrong. Interesting. And what else? Ben, you might need to put a return in there. I can't tell whether it's Saint Sebastian or Mother Teresa. That's the one, Ben. Good stuff. Oh. Izzy's going for Francis of Assisi, fortitude and gratitude. Interesting. Interesting. It's a bit like commenting on the horse races, this, or football. You know, it's even better, though. Saint Sebastian, strength, stamina, perseverance, courage, and justice. And then what if... Josh has joined us. Josh has joined us. So find a box. I think the second box is free. Josh, if you want to use the second row. So put your name on the left. J for Josh would do. Okay. So Ben's gone for humility with Francis of Assisi. Interesting. Strength and stamina for the martyr, Saint Sebastian. Humility... Ben, even at this abstract distance, you crack me up. There you go, money laundering. There you go. I love it, love it, and love for Mary. Fortitude and gratitude. Josh is going for Sebastian's strength and stamina, perseverance, courage, and justice. Humility. Francis of Assisi, humility. Ollie's gone for and so on. Isabel is going for fortitude, gratitude, stamina, perseverance, courage, justice, and so on and so on. So what are the answers, the scores on the doors? Well, let's start with love. We'll go from the bottom top to the top. Mother Teresa is often associated as the beatified saints. So these are all beatified saints in the Catholic sense. And the process of beatification is in part a recognition of their virtue. They've also got to do all kinds of things like work miracles and so on. Francis of Assisi, well, he built a church. He had one of the first things he did was build a whole building, and then he built a whole monastic organization. And so he's linked with fortitude and gratitude. Saint Sebastian, strength, stamina, perseverance, courage, and justice. He's the guy who, even though he was shot up with arrows. He's one of the saints who's remembered for his martyrdom, refused to recant his faith. And then Mary, you think of the picture of the Annunciation as she comes out with what's called the Magnificat, my soul glorifies in the Lord my Savior. He's been mindful of his servant, her servantness, her servant heart, her humility. Okay, good stuff, guys. Back in the PowerPoint if you could. And we're going to make some notes today. This is a nice lesson. I want to play a little bit of video, first of all. That's going to introduce a bit of this, and then I'll go over it in a little bit more detail. So, just a little bit about virtue and let's see. Let's go with this. So this is a bit of a recap from another RE teacher. About half of it's recapping Aristotle, what we've done already, and about half of it is on Aquinas virtue ethics. So, have a look.
Talk about Aristotle's virtue ethics with a view to leading into how it has influenced Aquinas' natural law. You will not be asked a question directly on Aristotle's virtue ethics himself. It's important to realise that. You will be asked about Aquinas' idea of virtue. But we need to mention Aristotle first of all in order for you to understand how he's influenced Aquinas. So, Aristotle wrote about virtue in his ethics, and this is quite different from the legalistic ethics from Aquinas and the Bible. Instead, Aristotle goes back to the idea of final cause or purpose in his writing. He notices that all our actions are purposeful. Everything we do for a reason. So, for instance, I go to work so I can pay the bills. I pay the bills so that I can be comfortable. I want to be comfortable so I can have a nice life, and so on and so forth. Now, Aristotle noticed that this goes on and on in a chain, but he realized or reasoned that there should be an end to the chain. He argued that there must be something we do for its own sake, and this he called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is basically happiness. It's the all-round contented life. And for him, this is the only thing that we desire for its own sake and not for achieving any other further purpose. Eudaimonia for him is threefold. True happiness is not only my pleasure, but also includes other things as well. My pleasure is important, but I'm a member of society, and so true happiness will only be achieved if I care for others as well. In addition, of course, reason for Aristotle and then Aquinas was fundamental, and we couldn't really be happy properly as human beings unless we utilize that reason and achieve happiness as a philosopher, as an intellectual. Now that was a bit more tricky for some people than others, according to Aristotle, but all three should be sought in order for us to really achieve eudaimonia. Now, in order for us to achieve this eudaimonia, he felt we needed to follow a middle ground between a golden mean of two vices. The golden mean is this middle pathway. Now, for instance, if I show courage in my life, I might use my mind to try and work out what the most brave thing to do would be in any given situation, and then I would try and act bravely, courageously. If I have too much of that virtue, then I could be described as rash. I might leap in without thinking and do crazy things that really won't necessarily benefit people. And equally, if I lack courage or bravery, I could be described as a coward, where I fail to act. Another good example is modesty. We might argue that if I lack modesty, I can be shameless, whereas if I have too much of it, I could be described as shy. Now, Aristotle came up with 12 of these kind of virtues that each fell between two vices. And he felt that by being moderate, we could gradually develop this contentment, where we're not going crazy over the top and we're not holding back. We're living a full, all-round contented life. Now, this has been hugely influential on Aquinas. It's quite important that we should notice here that Aristotle felt that we are what we do, that excellence isn't just about following rules, and Aquinas took this on board. While his kind of ethics is legalistic and does contain rules, he took on board this idea that we've got to develop our personality. It's not enough to just follow rules. We've got to be virtuous people, and we can become virtuous by making virtue a habit. So here, as Aristotle is saying, we become brave by doing brave acts, but it's becoming a brave person that makes us virtuous, true moral beings. Now, we've mentioned this before in lessons, but it's important to revisit it at this point, because we can say that virtue is important because it helps us to understand the difference between real and apparent good, according to Aquinas. So it's Aquinas we're focusing on here. Aquinas talks about his real good, which is what our conscience can deduce by using rector ratio. Rector ratio, remember, is this idea of right reason. And right reason will help us to understand not just what we think might be good, but what is objectively good, what really is good. A truly virtuous person who has practiced the virtues properly will be able to use their conscience effectively because they will be a moderate person and they will be able to understand how to be virtuous. And we can contrast this with the idea of apparent good, which is something that we think might be good, but actually it's not. Somebody who's not a moderate, virtuous person might tend to leap into behavior that we think is good at the time, but actually isn't. Somebody who lacks virtue might hold back because they're seeking something that they think is good, because they're frightened of maybe being courageous or whatever, but That's an apparent good. Holding back might sometimes seem good, but actually isn't. So it's all about searching for what God really wants from us and using our reason in order to deduce that. So according to Aquinas, reason can establish these 4 virtues. Aristotle had 12. Aquinas has 4 cardinal virtues. And these cardinal virtues are required in order for us to lead this moral life. Now, the first one, prudence, is the ability to judge well. It's a little bit like wisdom. It's reasoning. So we need to have that virtue of prudence in order to make the right judgments at the right time in the right place, in order to weigh things up. If we're prudent people, we should then be able to use our reason correctly. Justice is very important. And for him, of course, that's the idea of fairness. We've got to be able to make sure that we treat people equally, justly. Fortitude is the idea of courage, much like Aristotle's idea of courage there. And finally, temperance is moderation, not being excessive, not being deficient, but making sure that we tread this middle path. If we can establish these 4 cardinal reasoned virtues, we should be able to lead a moral life. But he wasn't prepared to stop there. The cardinal virtues are arrived at via reason, whereas the revealed virtues are given to us directly from God in the Bible. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13 shows us these revealed virtues. This is revealed directly from God in the New Testament. Reason can't help us to know that these virtues are important. We just have to trust that they are because God says so. And that's a virtue in itself. Faith dictates that we must trust God and that we must see these virtues as vital in order to achieve our ultimate telos. So here they are: faith, hope, and charity. Faith might be seen as trusting God. Hope might be hope for the future of an afterlife. And equally, charity is the idea of serving others. Now, we might argue here then that charity could also be described by Aquinas as love. Love is really the way that Christians tend to describe it today. And if you look in a modern translation of the Bible, you'll see it tends to say faith, hope, and love. This is this idea that we'll be kind and caring towards other people. Not that we'll necessarily feel loving towards them, but that we will show love, compassion, care towards others. So, these virtues are really important because they will help us then to lead not only a virtuous life, but be able to work out how we should behave in any given situation. In our lesson, we'll be trying to apply these virtues and see how they might be.
Okay, thank you. That was an introduction then to what we're looking at today.
So Aquinas' use of virtue ethics. Now you'll notice Aquinas isn't referenced here in the, I just switch now to the exam board syllabus. So we're using Aquinas' use of Aristotle's virtue ethics. And we're kind of asking the question of, is virtue ethics compatible with religious approaches? Last lesson we thought a little bit about this, whether it was humanistic or whether it could be used by religious people. And you'll see that that's what's being asked in towards the end of the section C here, compatibility or otherwise with religious approaches. And that's primarily Aquinas. So we're going to be asking that question later on. You're all going to be able to debate and discuss that. Do you think it's legitimate, bearing in mind what the theory is and its strengths and weaknesses, that it can be used as Aquinas envisions it, and so on. And that depends on some basic ideas we need to kind of think about. All right, so Aquinas on virtue. Now, next lesson we'll finish off, and it's getting a bit messy over the next couple of weeks but I'm still doing Tuesday and Wednesday next week. So I want to do one more lesson on virtue ethics, and then switch to helping us finish off both the virtue ethic and the the Bodhisattva doctrine anthology work. So we can
how many more weeks of term do we have? So I thought it was just one more week.
No. I'm sorry to tell you this. Oh, now that's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about this, Ollie. Great question. Normally, I hadn't put two and two together. In previous years, the last week of term has been given over for year 12 work experience. So, Ollie, I don't know what's happening. Are you finished? Have you guys heard anything, whether officially we're finishing at the end of next week or the week after that? For year 12, at least? Maybe not. Well, in any case, that gives us time to... We'll do 2 lessons anyway next week. And hopefully then that means you can get your work finished for me anyway. All right. So next lesson, we'll look at Alistair McIntyre and Philippa Foot. You might look ahead if you got your mock done and you're well under your way on your anthology work. You might look at some of the others, Anscombe and Hursthouse and Nosbaum, but we'll mention those next lesson anyway. Okay. So today we need to know about Aquinas' version, his adaptation of virtue ethics, specifically the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. Even better if we can understand what he's saying about the importance of the intellectual virtues and their relevance for working out the difference between I hope you remember this from natural moral law, the internal and the external goods. And then even better if at the end of the lesson you can think, has Aquinas successfully adopted Aristotle's virtue ethics and integrated it into his at least partially legalistic system of ethics or not? That's kind of what we're trying to do today. So last couple of lessons, there's a lot happening, and I've said this could be, in terms of the lesson teaching, a sort of key assessment task. Assess the claim that developing virtuous character is the best way of achieving eudaimonia. I'm not putting a 3-line whip in this. This would be for those people who are on task. They've done their mock exam. They're well on their way with their anthology work, particularly the questions at the end of the anthology pieces. But see how we go. If anybody wants to go at this, I'll happily mark it and get it back to you. Okay, so terrorists and hijacking. Has Aquinas hijacked virtue ethics? Now, atheists, secularists, humanists who like virtue ethics object to Catholics and their use of virtue ethics. There are different people who want to appropriate virtue ethics today, and some of them are atheists. Plenty of good scholars, and we'll look at those who have no belief in God, and they want to disassociate virtue ethics from anything of the transcendent. And so they would see it as being hijacked. So that's what we're thinking today. Is it compatible, or is it a combustible mix? Aquinas has just hijacked it. So first of all, you had mentioned there, Aquinas does something, and this is the first thing. He simplifies Aristotle's 12 moral virtues to 4. 4 cardinal virtues. Okay, anybody from the video, let me pick. You can either type them in. Who can be the first to type in or shout out a... sorry, I've just noticed your questions. Ben is asking a question about the mocks. Yeah, I just put them all together, Ben. I gave them all at the same time so that you could have maximum flexibility. I was going to give you one question each week, like on a Monday, last week, last week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then, but I just made it easier for you in effect, and I was then going to make it time bound so that you had to submit it in a 24-hour period. And I thought about it and I thought, oh, what'll happen? Well, Izzy won't get it done. So, I'll make sure, have to, give her a bit more time, as it were. I'm joking, Izzy. I'm joking. All right. Right. So what are the 4 cardinal virtues? Who can shout one out or type it in? Off you go. Go from the video. Shout it out. Type it in the chat. I can't see. That's the thing I can see. What are the 4 cardinal virtues? Aristotle, Aquinas' version of phronesis is it's the religious word for courage. We saw it at the beginning. Come on, work with me here, folks. Ollie, give me one of the 4 cardinal virtues you saw in the video.
Prudence.
Prudence, fantastic.
You do know they're on the screen there, don't you, sir?
Oh, are they? Yes, they're duh. I'm going to crack on, Ollie. Thank you for... Okay, there we go. Temperance, fortitude. So these are... So prudence. And that's like Aristotle's idea of phronesis or wise. And is it an intellectual virtue or is it a moral virtue? Well, it's a bit of both. Aquinas seems to think it's a moral virtue, but Aristotle seems to think it's an intellectual virtue. So that's interesting. Justice, well, we know what that means. Aristotle had it in his virtues, and we can think of the vice of excess or deficiency, injustice. Fortitude is also, you can think of that as courage, and temperance is not having too much or too little of a thing, particularly sort of alcohol and that. They're all interrelated in Aquinas' thinking, and he would explain why the temperate person is more likely to be the person of courage. They're all particularly linked to prudence, and so on. Okay, it's not on the screen this time. Next challenge. Who can shout out or type in one of the 7 deadly sins? I've given you a clue. The 7 heavenly virtues. What are the 7? Go on, type it in or shout it out.
Pride.
Pride, excellence. Anyone else? Trying to keep an eye on the chat as well. Gluttony, pride, lust. Well, don't put etc., Ben. Good. Anyone else? I'm trying to be interactive here. There we go. All right. So, charity, chastity, these are the heavenly virtues. The origin of these is in opposition to the deadly sins, or as they were originally known, the 7 cardinal vices. And if you wanted to update these for today, bizarrely, for the online world that we all inhabit, Facebook, envy, is all about envy, isn't it? Netflix, come on, who hasn't sat and binged watched something on Netflix? Pride, well, look at my Instagram picture of me doing whatever. Wrath, Twitter, I'm going to, shout about somebody on Twitter. Think President Trump and his horrible treats. Gluttony, Yelp, I never used Yelp, but apparently to make, sounds quite nice actually. Lust, well, Tinder, swipe left, swipe right. Greed, LinkedIn, it's a program all about getting your career going. So these are the 7 cardinal vices, and they are the opposites. They were then given opposites, the 7 heavenly virtues, as it were. Now, 5 of them appeared in Aristotle's list. Now, I could ask you to think back to his 12 moral virtues, and which of them actually appeared in his list. Don't worry too much. We'll look at those in a second. These were considered wrong for the person and the individual and for society. So, society that is full of anger. Think about our current society, wrath, a society that is, angry at things. And they're very much still in use today by Catholics. These are thought of as mortal sins as opposed to venial sins. If you break any one of these, in the Catholic practices, you need to go to confession, quick, smart. If you die with unconfessed mortal sin, you don't get to go to purgatory, you go straight to hell. So these are, you would say still very much still in use in the Catholic Church. But some of them are not in Aristotle, and this shows this development of Aquinas in his theory and practice of virtue. One of the most interesting ones is pride. I argue that I think Aristotle had that as a virtue, whereas Aquinas has it as a vice. Now, there's an argument we can, if you remember it for the end of the lesson. Has Aquinas successfully adopted virtue ethics? Well, he hasn't, and because he's made a vice a virtue, and vice versa. Pun intended. Haha. Okay, so these hijacked virtues. Because in addition to the sort of ordinary virtues that Aristotle talks about, Aquinas adds what he calls the revealed virtues or the theological virtues. These are things, he thinks there are some virtues you can figure out with your reason, with your logic, as following Aristotle's golden mean. And the four cardinal virtues are like that. But there are other virtues that you have to discover through religious experience, through revelation. And in the Bible, we have lists of virtues, and the three greatest virtues are described and referenced by Aristotle from Paul's book to the Corinthians, 13:13. Faith, hope, and love are referenced. Paul says, but now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. So for the Christian, the revealed virtue that's the greatest of all the virtues to practice is love. And that brings in an interesting idea. Is love even a virtue? Is there a golden mean of love? Can you be too loving? There's all kinds of interesting questions. I can imagine being too hopeful, or perhaps too faithful, but too loving. That's an interesting. Can you even use it? Well, you can't get to it by the golden mean, certainly. That's why it's a revealed virtue. So what was Aquinas' purpose in adopting Aristotle's virtue? Well, he felt, like Aristotle, there must be a true teleos, a final teleos. Now, Aristotle had arrived at eudaimonia as the true teleos. And Aquinas would agree, if you use your reason, that's as high as you can go. But for the Christian and for the person who believes in the transcendent, there's an even higher teleos than the flourishing society. Now remember Aquinas' in natural moral law, the third precept of natural moral law is the ordered society. And the fourth is the rational mind. There's a lot of Aristotle going on in natural moral law. But logic and reason can get you only so far. Then it has to be revealed. What logic and reason are? Intellect, because it hasn't been damaged by sin, by the fall, can help us. It can help us and the intellectual virtues can help us because they help us differentiate between what are real and what are not real in terms of what is good in life, the real and the apparent goods. So let's look at these in order. There are true teleos and the real and apparent good. So let's just remind ourselves. So a real good is something that, according to natural law, correctly reasons that it is a good thing for the moral agent to achieve their teleos. An apparent good is something that only seems to be. It, in the end, diminishes a person's human nature, and it is false reasoning, faulty logic would arrive at an apparent good. And because in the end, it doesn't help a moral agent achieve their God-given purpose, which is not in the end eudaimonia, something higher. So these two things are connected. So there's old Mother Teresa. Remember, her virtue is one of love. And she talks about love for the other, love for the street children of Bombay. And maybe she was a money launderer. I don't know, Ben, but maybe she had vices as well. Wouldn't like to comment on anyone that's particular virtues and vices, but I'd agree. No, I think the saints weren't perfect myself. So there's a lot of similarity in Christianity and Aristotle in general. Aquinas and Aristotle both think that we should, in the end, not just help ourselves, but help other people, but for a different reason. The Christian adoption of the virtues demonstrates how important virtues are needed for helping people in community. If you're not intellectually virtuous, then how can you know how to help people? You might be motivated by love, but if you're an idiot, then you're not going to put together a food bank and deliver, during COVID-19. You're not going to have the intellectual ability to do that. So the virtues need to work together. Aristotle stressed, and we mentioned this earlier, the importance of community in moral development. In fact, it's all important. You can't develop morally outside of the context of other people. You can't develop humility or any of the other virtues outside of other people. Courage, take courage. Can you develop that outside of a community and where there are threats that you need to respond to? I suppose you could argue an animal might threaten you and you could develop courage over, I don't know. We could think about that. The best people in society are interested in us in not just themselves, but the development of the community as a whole. And what does Jesus say? He says, love your neighbors, you love yourself. That's the greatest commandment, is to love God and to love your neighbor. Now, that's an interesting stress. It's not one of Aristotle's stress. He would just say, love your neighbor. And he wouldn't even use the word love. Help your neighbor, because that's a virtuous thing to do. So eudaimonia, the person who achieves eudaimonia, will be interested in developing their community as a whole. And the Christian and Aquinas would applaud this. But Aquinas and other Christians say, if that's all you ever do in life, helping other people, you haven't reached your true and final goal. What is the true and final goal? It is beatitude. Ooh, there's a good word. Beatitude. Make sure you write that down. We need to define it. What does Aquinas mean by beatitude? Well, a little bit of history. Unlike St. Augustine, who you've studied, his response to the problem of evil, for example, he goes on to maintain that everyone, religious or not, can achieve some kind of imperfect happiness. We'll equate that with eudaimonia as Aristotle talks about it. A sense of purpose, a sense of your potential. But Aquinas believes ultimate final happiness, if we will not be found in just helping our fellow man, in just reaching our virtuous potential. No, it consists in beatitude, or a sense of union, supernatural union with God. Quite mystical. Aquinas was quite influenced by Maimonides, a Jewish Kabbalistic mystic. And it does make one wonder, is he more influenced by his philosophy than the Bible at this point? So such a teleos, such an end, is far beyond what we thought through our natural human capacities we could attain. So for this reason, we do not need the virtues, not only need Aristotle's 12 virtues, or even just the summary of them as the 4 cardinal virtues that Aquinas gives. we need God to transform our nature, to perfect, or as he calls it, to deify it. Wow. Aristotle had none of this in mind. He did not think our natures needed to be deified. They were just needed to, be worked on through our own reason. It was self-effort. Nice link to Buddhism here. Other effort and self-effort. Aristotle thinks self-effort is enough. Aquinas thinks self-effort can take us so far, but then we need the grace of God to come and help us participate in the divine beatitude. The eternal gaze of the soul on God is the idea of the final state of beatitude, union with God. And we do it in this life through what are called the spiritual disciplines. We receive this grace for the Catholic through the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. And these are seen as spiritual disciplines: baptism, confirmation, taking your first Eucharist or Mass, getting married, having the healing anointing of the sick, being ordained as a minister, and going to confession. These are the spiritual disciplines that enable us to receive God's grace and help us participate in the divine beatitude. And there's a whole range of spiritual disciplines beyond those mere sacraments that people like Ignatius de Loyola and other Catholics developed, the Desert Fathers and such. So, how are we doing? Have you figured out, have you made notes on the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues? Let me just double check the questions. Ben says, I think I'll have to talk to a priest for a full month to confess my sins. I'm with you on that, Ben. Gluttony. I mean, come on. Who hasn't had Ben and Jerry's £5 chocolate little tub of ice cream? Yeah, I'm with you, Ben. Absolutely with you. Okay, so I hope you've got that. I could ask questions. We're going to move on to looking at the internal and external goods. The internal and external goods. Do stop me. Anybody's got a microphone, I will look at questions, but if you want to shout out any questions at any point, we'll take them. Okay, so do feel free to pause and ask for anything to be clarified. Okay, so if I asked you, could you tell me what the 4 cardinal virtues is, the 3 theological virtues, and how they kind of work together in his mind to help us achieve our true teleos, the idea of the beatitude, the beatitude. Okay, so there is this difference in Aquinas' thinking between actually good acts and acts that seem good but aren't. So and we did this in natural moral law. This goes back to to before Aristotle, before Plato, to the Stoics. True law is right reason in accordance with our nature. So we can deduce, Aristotle is confident about that our intellectual abilities are perfectly good enough, and so is Aquinas. Our intellectual abilities, our intellectual virtues are good enough. He would call it our conscience, our rectia rational, our right reason. And if we use it properly, we understand if an action is a really good action or only it seems to be a good action. And we'll give some examples of this. It will not just be good according to our opinion, but actually objectively good. So, and we can figure that out using our reason. So, and this is a form of phronesis, a form of prudence, a form of thinking, as it were, using the intellectual virtues, or rectia rationa. So right reason helps the truly virtuous person who has practices the virtue properly will be able to use their conscience effectively, because they will be a moderate person. So someone's using their right reason if they're a moderate person. They're the 4 cardinal virtues are evident in their life, and they will not only be able to do that? Well, they'll be able to understand how to be basically virtuous. And perhaps this is the foundation for then applying theological or religious virtues, as it were. So the good person uses their ratio, the virtuous person. Remember Aristotle's 4 types of people: the virtuous person, the continent person, the incontinent person, and the vicious person. Well, as we move from the virtuous to the vicious person, Aristotle would agree. What is an apparent good? It's something that seems good, a good act to us, but we're using faulty thinking to arrive at that. For example, casual sex. I'm not going to, this would be inappropriate of me to make any jokes at this point, so I absolutely won't. I get in trouble for making jokes about this sort of stuff, so I won't. Casual sex to the teenager, might feel good because the act gives us physical pleasure in the short term. Or we might replace this with, I don't know, something else. But reason demonstrates that it's not actually good. For example, you would reason from the primary precept that the purpose of sex, etc., then you would apply it in a secondary principle and so on. A moderate person, someone who's practicing the cardinal virtues, will not leap in, they'll use their prudence, will not leap into a behavior they think is good, but someone who is not virtuous, who is vicious. Someone who's vicious might have a deficiency of virtue, maybe the virtue of courage. They're cowardly. So they might leap into an action because of social pressure, social psychology as such. So here we have the integration or attempted integration of virtue ethics with the teleos and the means of achieving the teleos through the real and apparent good. Okay, getting on quite quickly through this. So in a minute, we're going to think about, has Aristotle successfully integrated virtue ethics into his religious system? And we're going to do a little lesson end task, and I want to leave some time to have a chat with anyone who is struggling with the mock exam or to take any questions. So let's have a look at this last little section. I'm going to check the chat, or if anybody wants to shout a question. At this point, no more chat questions, so I'm assuming you're all okay. You've got internal, external goods. If you anything you want to ask, shout it out or type it in. Or we'll continue and then think about. Okay, we'll continue then. So, has Aquinas successfully integrated? Can he persuade us that there's a higher teleos that is reached through, in part, the 4 cardinal virtues, but finally only through the 3 theological virtues? So has he successfully integrated the religious approach? 2 slides to think about this, 1 for and 1 against. So let's think on the positive side. Well, maybe he has successfully adapted virtue ethics for his wider ethical project, natural moral law. A couple of things to kind of think about here. Aquinas acknowledges his debt to Aristotle, but he isn't slavishly following Aristotle. He puts it like this. He says, grace does not destroy nature, but brings it to its fulfillment. Grace does not destroy nature, but brings it to its fulfillment. So we have here a sort of dualistic system, nature and grace, the rational mind and the religious experience, reason and revelation, going hand in hand. Is this a solid venture, or is it a combustible mix, is what you want to think about. And obviously, if you're the atheist, you're going to say you can't put both of these together. But there are Protestants as well. The Reformation would be critical of this sort of dualistic thinking. and would say it's all about revelation, not about reason. We'll come back to that in a minute. So in terms of it being a good integration, the understanding of the relationship between natural and supernatural orders, Catholics argue, allows Aquinas to preserve the whole Aristotelian conceptual sort of schema, apparatus, and put it to a wider use than Aristotle envisioned. It's not Aristotle's fault he didn't have revelation, Aquinas argues. If he had, he no doubt would have quickly adopted them. He sees Aristotle as a sort of unbaptized Christian, as it were, working with the best that was available to him. Within ethics, this approach allows Aquinas, we can argue, or the Catholic would argue, to affirm that there is indeed such a thing as natural happiness, and that there's a certain forcefulness to that. Well, who doesn't think there's natural happiness? That if you've reached your potential, you've done really well in this mock exam, for example, hint, hint, then you can be satisfied with your life. But do such things lose their satisfaction? I can't get no satisfaction. Well, there is a certain argument about that. People who reach the pinnacle of success, who achieve everything, and then still are unhappy. Does that point to a higher, a more true teleos? It's called the argument from desire, that there's something beyond mere potential, mere eudaimonia. That's supernatural. That is and it may be the beatitude idea or something else. Certainly Buddhists would see it as something else to Christians, but they would agree there's a transcendent teleos beyond mere potential. So as Christians affirm, there's such a thing as supernatural happiness. We find this coming out, for example, in Augustine. He does talk about it, that the heart is restless till it finds its rest in God. We need something permanent, not temporary, to find our happiness in, i.e. the love of God, for Augustine. And Aquinas would echo that, but he would change it to this sort of union with God idea, the mystical idea. So Catholics today the world over continue to seek this beatitude, this union with God. They practice the virtues as the kind of foundation and then reach for a religious experience that may be, I guess, triggered through the spiritual disciplines. And maybe we need the work of the Holy Spirit to bring out the fruit of the Spirit. That might be a way it would be put. Maybe we need the sacraments of the church to receive the Holy Spirit and thus to build into our lives these love, joy, faith, hope, and love as at the very least. And maybe that makes sense within a religious framework. But does it make sense to the atheist, to the agnostic? Well, probably less so. So that's an argument to say it's successful. Let's look at an argument to say it's not successful. Well, Catholic virtue has never gone away. That's true. It's never gone away. Catholic churches have always been talking about virtue. But it's true that the belief in virtue has waned as a general, credible, ethical system until it was perhaps rediscovered in the 1950s. Catholics have been going on about it. Never stopped, really. How did it go away? Well, the important thing is the Reformation. The idea that we have a sort of natural potential for virtue, that we can achieve so much of a sort of human happiness just using our intellectual virtues in particular, and reaching for the four cardinal virtues. With this natural ability, we tend towards, Aquinas talks about the Syndra's rule. If you remember that, we tend towards the good and not the evil. Augustine talks about all men seek happiness. Well, Calvin has a different view. We have Luther, then Calvin in the Protestant Reformation. And Calvin teaches a directly opposite belief or doctrine, the doctrine of total depravity, in his theory that's been summarized as TULIP, total T for total depravity. The intellect, as well as the other aspects of being a human, have been muddied, stained by sin. We can't trust our reason to arrive at true knowledge. It's always affected by sin. And so the Calvinist, sort of almost proto-postmodernist, says that you can't trust your thinking. It could lead you astray. None of us can reach the cardinal virtues naturally. On the other hand, in addition, it was challenged in the Enlightenment. The idea that revelation is needed was rejected in a turn to reason and autonomy in the Enlightenment. And so the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, saw a return to hedonism. And as we've seen, hedonism isn't much interested in mediocre, limp sort of lives. We want the full can experience in the French Revolution. We want hedonistic enjoyment. And the idea of limiting our lives was seen as sort of Victorian, prudish. Some idea of spiritual or moral formation has become old hat in today's world, even a form of oppression, I guess. So which is it then? We've thought about this today. The four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Faith, hope, and love is the theological virtues. The idea there is a true teleos that we should aim for, that is greater than the imperfect happiness that eudaimonia would be as a teleos, and that the real good virtue can help so far in establishing real goods from apparent goods and vice versa. Okay, so well done. What I want us to do is go to the lesson end task in the Google Classroom. Looks a bit like this. And I'll just have a look at the chat and see if... So what do you think? Do you think virtue ethics is or is not compatible with natural moral law? So put your name in, choose a box. There's several boxes below. Pick one that you like the sound of. Give your reasoning if you can think of a quote that would support it or any evidence. And if you can think, why have you made a really strong argument or weak argument? And how does this link to anything else like Buddhism or, okay? Now I'm going to have while you're doing that, quick look at the chat. See if there are any questions, or you can shout your questions out. Ben asks, then how can we trust the Bible if we can't trust our reason to trust the Bible? Great question, Ben. And perhaps you might read a little book by Alvin Plantinga called Reason in the Bounds of Religion. Reformed epistemology has thought about this. And how long have you got? This is epistemology. There are three kinds of epistemology. Skepticism, which is kind of what you're saying here. Methodism, which you might use a lot of the time, which is thinking if something's true, if we know a method of, and then particularism. And Reformed epistemology is a type of particularism that says we can know things to be true because we just start with other things we accept to be true. And these are properly basic truths. But getting into properly basic epistemology in the 30 seconds we have now, Ben, might be a stretch. But Alvin Plantinga's books on this are one way to look at the arguments. He wrote a trilogy of books on this, and he thinks the idea of warrant is better than justification. And so you'll have to come up with your own view in epistemology. Are you epistemological skepticist, epistemological methodist, or epistemological particularist? And there are arguments for these three positions. Okay, let's see how we have done on our lesson end task. Where is it? There it is. So, I'll give you a bit longer, actually. So what we're doing is constructing a big old 15-mark response here, or the guts of it, that we could use if we so desired. We're not going to, because that would be evil. Evil. Okay, what have we all said to finish off today? So Ollie is saying he doesn't think virtue ethics and Aquinas go together. It's built upon learning and experiencing virtues and leniency of not being born with them, whereas natural moral law, you're born with morality. Yes, there is a sense of that. In the Syndrash rule would be the terminology. We tend towards doing the right and the wrong. And I guess there's a little bit of Plato in Aquinas, I guess. The law written on our hearts by God. Yes, absolutely right. This quote from Paul, that the law is written on our hearts. Okay, I wonder what we could link that to. Synoptic link, or an evaluation. Yeah, that's a fairly strong point you've made there. Struggling to think why. Yeah, because it coheres together to argue that from the idea that we have an inbuilt sense of morality, that contradicts. Surely that just contradicts. And again, you could link this to Buddhism, I guess. Buddhism is very interested in the development of virtue. Do we have any inbuilt virtue when we begin? That's an interesting idea. No. Every new rebirth is you begin with a blank slate. Even your dharma actions from the previous life only lead to some effect in the next life. You could link it that way. Isabel thinks good that they do works well together. The equation of reason and revelation, you think is a sort of solid equation. Grace does not destroy nature, but brings it to its fulfillment. Love it. Evaluation, we're nurtured to understand grace. Links primarily precepts to educate children, worship God. Lovely. And epistemic distance. Yes, of course. No, I'm not going to say Tillich. What's his name? John Hick's idea of epistemic distance, the problem of evil and suffering. Excellent. And who's this? Ben has said, without self-trust, we can't trust our deductions we make. So therefore, we're doubting our own reason. It only leads to a lack of ability to make our own judgment whatsoever. So by questioning our own logic, we make our logic inconsistent. So we cannot be trusted. So he's making the epistemological point here. So we should question our own senses or logic that we can't trust. So there speaks an epistemological Methodist, actually, the way you're phrasing that. Not a skeptic, more of a Methodist. Our reason is muddied by the fall. Yes, that's a good quote. We are made to think. Ooh, I wonder what that's a link to. We can't trust our deductions. You could again link this to Buddhism. Be you lamps to yourself. There you go. There's your quote. Be you lamps to yourself, the Buddha said. Work it out for yourself. In Buddhism, figure out your own method of learning stuff and don't trust what I say. So Buddhism makes this claim to that sort of empirical Methodist approach. Right, folks, that's it for today. That's absolutely cracking. We've done some super work. I just wanted to be here for anybody who wants